The sound that cut through the cabin wasn't shouting. It was the rip of fabric. A dry, tearing sound that stopped conversations mid-sentence and froze hands halfway to seatbelts. Heads turned. Breath held. In the front row of the first-class cabin, a man was being pulled to his feet by someone who didn't bother to look him in the eye. Someone whispered, "Is this really happening?" The plane hadn't even pushed back yet. Harold Bennett stood unsteadily in the aisle, his left shoulder twisted where a hand gripped too hard. The sleeve of his charcoal blazer had torn clean along the seam. Threads hung loose, trembling with the vibration of the aircraft's idle engines. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flail. He simply inhaled once slow and controlled the way men do when they've learned that panic helps no one. He was 61 years old. His hair was cropped short and silvered at the temples. His face carried lines, earned, not rushed. The kind of face people trusted in quiet rooms. The kind of face that never asked for attention. "Sir, you need to come with us," the airport security officer said, already tightening his grip as if expecting resistance. Harold looked down at the hand on his arm, then up. His eyes were calm, too calm. "I'm standing," he said evenly. "There's no need to pull." The officer didn't answer. He glanced instead toward the front galley where Linda Crawford stood rigid, her posture straight as a ruler, her lips pressed thin. 55 years old, 27 years with the airline. She had seen every kind of passenger there was. She believed that gave her instinct. She believed that gave her authority. "Let's keep this moving," she said loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "We're already close to losing our slot." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone scoffed. Someone else shook their head slowly, like a man watching a bridge crack from the middle out. Harold's eyes flicked just once toward the windows. Morning light spilled across the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare, pale and cold. The city beyond was waking up. Coffee brewing, radios humming, people heading to work believing the rules would hold at least for today. Behind him, a voice cut in sharp and impatient. "This is ridiculous. I told you I needed that seat." Brian Whitmore leaned into the aisle, one hand braced on a headrest. He was 38, clean-cut, wearing a navy jacket that still had the creases from the store. His watch caught the light when he moved. He'd arrived late, breathless, annoyed, already irritated by the day, not bending the way he expected. "My father flies this route all the time," Brian continued. "You people know that." Linda turned her head slightly toward him. Her expression softened by a fraction. Not kindness, recognition. "We're handling it, Mr. Whitmore." Harold heard it, the shift in tone. He didn't react. He had heard that change before, in boardrooms and conference halls decades earlier, when a different kind of uniform carried the same assumption. So Linda said again, now facing him directly, "You were asked twice to relocate. You refused. At this point, we're past discussion." Harold met her gaze. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in her jaw, the strain behind her eyes. This wasn't confidence. It was commitment. She had chosen a path and could not afford to reconsider it in front of witnesses. "I asked for a supervisor," Harold said quietly. "I asked to review the seating manifest. None of that happened." "You were delaying the flight," Linda replied. "That gives us authority." The word authority hung there heavy. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, his knuckles white against the armrest. A woman 2 rows back whispered to her husband. He hasn't even raised his voice. The security officer tugged again, harder this time. Harold stumbled half a step forward. His shoe scuffed the carpet. The tear in his jacket widened with a soft snap. That sound, the one everyone heard. "Careful," Harold said. His voice dropped. Not in anger, in warning. "I'm not resisting. We don't need commentary," the officer said. Linda turned away, already moving toward the cockpit door, as if the decision were sealed and the moment behind her no longer mattered. That was when a phone chimed, then another. Screens lifted subtle at first, then openly. A woman in her late 60s hair, pinned neatly, held her phone low but steady. A retired school principal, maybe. She had seen rules bent before. She had learned to recognize the moment when silence became permission. Brian noticed the phones. His mouth tightened. "Seriously?" "Put that away. You're all going to make us late." No one listened. Harold was pushed really toward the front of the cabin. He caught himself on the edge of a seat, steadying his breath. His pulse was slow. He could feel it in his throat. He had learned long ago that when men lost control of their breathing, they lost everything else with it. As they reached the aircraft door, the jet bridge visible through the narrow opening, Harold paused. "Sir," the officer snapped. "Move." Harold did. 1 step, then another. The air shifted, cooler, sharper, the smell of metal and rubber replacing recycled cabin air. Behind him, Linda called out, "Close the door as soon as they're off. We can still make our window." The door slammed. The sound echoed down the jet bridge like punctuation. For a moment, there was only the hum of the terminal and the distant call of a gate agent announcing another boarding group. Harold stood alone, the officer releasing his grip with visible relief. "Procedure completed. Problem removed." "You can collect your belongings later," the officer said. "You'll need to speak with airport administration." Harold nodded once. "Of course." He waited until the officer turned away, until footsteps receded, until the eyes moved on to the next disruption waiting somewhere else. Then he straightened. He smoothed the torn edge of his jacket fingers, precise, almost gentle. He picked up his glasses from the concrete floor and cleaned the lens with his shirt cuff. His hands did not shake. A younger man in a reflective vest lingered at the far end of the jet bridge, pretending to check a clipboard while watching him with something close to curiosity. Harold met his eyes briefly. The man looked away. Harold reached into his inner pocket and took out his phone. The screen lit his face with a cool glow. There were no missed calls, no alerts. He had made sure of that. He tapped one contact. No name. Just a number he had memorized decades ago. The call connected on the first ring. "Morning," said a voice on the other end. Older. Measured. Awake long before the city. "They've removed me," Harold said. He kept his voice low, not because he was afraid of being overheard, but because he didn't need anyone else to hear this. A pause. The faint sound of a cup being set down. "Which flight?" the voice asked. Harold glanced back through the narrow window in the aircraft door. He could see movement inside. Linda leaning toward Brian, her shoulders loosening now that the problem was gone. Brian settling into the seat, stretching his legs, already forgetting the man he had displaced. Same one, Harold said. Same company. Another pause, longer this time. Understood, the voice replied. We were already close. I know, Harold said. That's why I'm calling now. He ended the call before any reassurances could be offered. He didn't need them. Harold slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a step forward toward the terminal, toward the low morning light spilling across the floor. Behind him, the plane began to move. Slowly, confidently, unaware. Inside the cabin, Linda exhaled for the first time in 10 minutes. She adjusted her scarf, smoothed her skirt, and forced a smile as she passed a tray of drinks down the aisle. No one smiled back. A man near the window kept his phone raised, recording the empty space where Harold had been sitting. He didn't know why he felt compelled to keep filming. Only that something about the way that man had stood silent and unbowed made him uneasy. The engines grew louder. The city waited. And somewhere beneath the surface of a system that believed it had corrected an inconvenience, a switch had just been flipped. The terminal smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a warmer too long. Harold Bennett walked past the gate, without slowing his stride, steady, despite the rip in his jacket and the faint ache blooming along his shoulder. People moved around him, with the casual urgency of a weekday morning, rolling bags, murmuring into phones, trusting the machinery of schedules and screens. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. That anonymity was familiar. He had learned long ago how power often traveled without announcing itself. At the end of the concourse, beneath a flickering departures board, an airport supervisor waited. His name badge read Thomas Reed, late 40s, hair thinning, tie loosened already, as if the day had begun with friction. He held a tablet against his chest like a shield. Mr. Bennett Reed said, glancing down at the screen. We need to clear up what happened back there. Harold nodded. I agree. Reed gestured toward a glass-walled office just off the main walkway. Inside, 2 molded chairs faced a narrow desk. A camera blinked red in the corner. Documentation. Liability. Reed closed the door and exhaled through his nose, rubbing his forehead with his thumb. Look. Reed began lowering himself into the chair. I know this isn't how anyone wants to start a day. Harold remained standing. He rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair, but did not sit. Neither is being removed from a seat you paid for. Reed shifted. The report says you refused a crew instruction. The report is incomplete, Harold said. I requested a supervisor. I requested verification. Neither occurred. Reed scrolled, his brow furrowed. He was already behind. He knew it. The flight was at risk of missing its departure window. So the solution was force, Harold replied, not accusing, observing. Reed's eyes flicked up. He hesitated. Sometimes decisions get made fast. Harold leaned forward, just enough for Reed to notice. Fast decisions are not the same as correct ones. A silence settled between them. Outside the glass, a janitor pushed a cart slowly past headphones, on nodding to a rhythm no one else could hear. Reed cleared his throat. We'll need a statement. You'll get one, Harold said. In writing. Through counsel. Reed stiffened. Counsel Harold finally sat. The chair creaked under his weight. He folded his hands loosely in his lap. I don't make statements without representation. Reed glanced at the camera, then back at Harold. Are you planning to file a complaint? Harold met his gaze. I'm planning to tell the truth. The words landed heavier than Reed expected. He swallowed. All right. We'll arrange. Reed's tablet chimed. Once, then again. His eyes dropped to the screen. Color drained from his face. Is there a problem? Harold asked. Reed didn't answer immediately. His fingers moved quickly, tapping, scrolling. The red blink of the camera seemed louder now. This is strange, Reed murmured. Harold waited. Reed looked up. The airline just flagged the incident internally. They've requested all footage, all audio. They're escalating it. As they should, Harold said. Reed shook his head slowly. They don't do that this fast. Harold's expression didn't change. Inside, however, the board had already shifted. He could feel it, the quiet movement of pieces long positioned. Reed's tablet chimed again. This time, he stood. Excuse me for 1 second. He stepped outside the office, lowering his voice, but not enough. Harold could hear fragments. Yes, already I understand. No, he's still here. Harold leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling. He remembered another room decades earlier, a supply depot overseas. Fluorescent lights humming, while a younger man explained why a shipment hadn't arrived and why men were now waiting on empty stomachs. That day had taught him something essential. Systems didn't fail loudly. They failed politely behind closed doors with paperwork and excuses. The door opened. Reed re-entered his posture, altered. Straighter, cautious. Mr. Bennett, he said. There's been a request. Harold raised an eyebrow. From whom? Reed hesitated. From corporate. Which corporate? Harold asked gently. Reed swallowed. The airline's legal department? Harold nodded. I expected that. They're asking that you remain on site, Reed continued. Voluntarily, until their team arrives. Harold smiled faintly. Voluntarily is an interesting word. Reed shifted his weight. They want to talk to you before the flight lands. Harold's eyes flicked just once toward the gate monitor. The flight had pushed back. Taxiing now. He could picture the cabin. The forced calm. The eyes that would not meet Linda's. Tell them I'll wait, Harold said. I'm in no hurry. Reed blinked. You're willing to stay? Harold folded his hands again. I believe in letting people explain themselves. Another chime. Reed looked down. His breath caught. What is it? Harold asked. Reed's voice dropped. The fuel supplier just notified operations. They're suspending automatic credit extensions. Harold tilted his head slightly. Temporarily, Reed nodded. Pending review. Harold exhaled slowly. Not relief. Recognition. Reed stared at the tablet, then at Harold, something dawning behind his eyes. Do you know anything about that? Harold's gaze was steady. I know that reviews happen when risk increases. Reed laughed nervously. This can't be connected. That's a massive decision. Massive decisions rarely feel massive at first, Harold replied. Outside the office, raised voices drifted down the concourse. A woman in a blazer hurried past, phone pressed tight to her ear. A man in an airline badge, jogged tie, flapping face flushed. Reed rubbed his hands together. This is getting above my pay grade. Harold smiled again, thin, but not unkind. It often does. Another call came in. Reed answered without looking at the screen. Yes, he's here. Yes, he's cooperative. A pause. I understand. He ended the call and stood. They're sending a representative from downtown. How long? Harold asked. Reed checked his watch. An hour, maybe less. Harold nodded. I'll wait. Reed hesitated, then spoke. For what it's worth, I watched part of the footage. Harold said nothing. Reed swallowed. You didn't deserve that. Harold met his eyes. Deserving has very little to do with outcomes. Reed stepped back toward the door. He paused there, hand on the handle. Who are you, Mr. Bennett? Harold considered the question. He thought of the men who had trusted him with cargo lists and lives, of the contracts signed in quiet rooms, of the systems that ran not on goodwill, but on reliability. I'm someone who keeps things moving, he said finally. Reed nodded slowly and left. The office grew quiet again. The camera blinked red. Outside the airport continued its rhythm. Announcements echoed. Wheels rolled. Somewhere above, Flight 308 lifted into the morning sky, carrying with it the belief that what had happened was finished. Harold sat alone, hands folded, eyes closed for just a moment. He listened to his breathing. Slow. Even. The way it had always been, before a long operation. On his phone, deep in his pocket, a message arrived. No sound. No vibration. Just words waiting. He did not check it. Not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was sit still and let the world come to him. The first person to arrive wasn't a lawyer. It was a woman in a grey blazer with an airline badge clipped too carefully to her lapel, like it might fall off if she breathed wrong. Her name was Karen Holt, Director of Corporate Risk. Early 50s, efficient haircut, eyes trained to look for leaks in walls that everyone else pretended were solid. She stopped outside the glass office and didn't go in right away. She watched Harold through the transparent wall, noting the torn jacket, the calm posture, the hands folded without tension. People like him unsettled her. Loud men were predictable. Quiet ones forced you to imagine consequences. Thomas Reed hurried to meet her, whispering urgently. Karen listened without interrupting her gaze, never leaving Harold. When Reed finished, she nodded once and stepped inside. Mr. Bennett, she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, practiced. Thank you for waiting. Harold rose. I had time. Karen gestured to the chair, but did not sit herself. She remained standing, tablet tucked under her arm. Control position. I'm here to understand what occurred and see how we can resolve it efficiently. Efficiently for whom Harold asked. Karen's lips curved into something that wanted to be a smile. For everyone. Harold sat. Then we should start with facts. Karen nodded. Agreed. According to the preliminary report, you refused to comply with a crew instruction related to seat reassignment. Harold leaned back. That is not a fact. That is an interpretation. Karen blinked once. You were asked to move. I was asked to surrender a seat I had paid for without explanation, verification, or compensation, Harold said. I asked for escalation. That request was denied. Karen tapped her tablet. And when security arrived, I stood. Harold replied. I did not resist. Karen glanced up. The footage shows. The footage shows me being pulled, Harold said. His voice was steady, but something beneath it sharpened. There is a difference. Karen studied him for a moment longer than protocol required. Mr. Bennett, our priority is minimizing exposure. Harold tilted his head. Exposure to what? Karen inhaled. Litigation, regulatory scrutiny, reputational damage. Harold's eyes flicked briefly to the camera in the corner. Those are the consequences of actions, not causes. Karen's jaw tightened. We are prepared to offer compensation. I'm not here to bargain, Harold said. Karen shifted her weight. Everyone bargains. Harold shook his head slowly. Some people enforce. The room seemed to shrink. Karen felt it. She pressed her lips together. May I ask what you do, Mr. Bennett? You may, Harold said. But the answer won't help you. Karen hesitated. She had read the file. Sparse. Third-party booking. No status flags. No alerts. Humor me. I manage infrastructure, Harold said. Things people don't notice until they stop working. Karen felt a chill she didn't expect. She straightened. The airline has no record of prior issues with you. Neither did the military, Harold replied. Until the day they did. Karen's tablet chimed softly. She glanced down. Her brows drew together. She excused herself with a raised finger and stepped outside. Harold watched through the glass as Karen's composure cracked. Not fully. Just enough. She paced 2 steps, stopped, spoke into her headset in a low voice, nodded once. Then twice her free hand rubbed her temple. When she returned, her tone had changed. More careful, less polished. Mr. Bennett, she said. There's been a development. Harold remained seated. Go on. Our fuel credit line with Mid-States Energy has been suspended, Karen said. Temporarily. Harold nodded. I was informed. Karen froze. You were. I said infrastructure, Harold replied. Karen swallowed. This is not standard. It affects multiple flights. Risk adjustments often do, Harold said. Karen's fingers tightened around her tablet. Are you directly involved in that decision? Harold met her gaze. I am involved in many decisions. Karen looked away first. Another figure appeared outside the office. A man in a navy suit, hair white at the edges, posture rigid with habit. Richard Coleman didn't hurry. He never did. He walked like time adjusted itself around him. Karen turned as he approached. Recognition flashed. Mr. Coleman. Richard nodded politely. Ms. Holt. Karen stiffened. I represent Mr. Bennett, Richard said, stepping past her into the office. And several funds that are suddenly very concerned about your airline's exposure. Karen's breath caught. This is escalating quickly. Richard smiled faintly. No, it's simply becoming visible. He shook Harold's hand, then took the seat beside him. I trust you're well. I've had better mornings, Harold said. Richard turned to Karen. Let's be clear. My client was removed from a paid seat without cause. The footage is already circulating. Regulatory bodies are making inquiries, and now financial partners are reassessing risk. Karen held herself together by force. We can issue an apology. Richard nodded. Public ones are nice. Binding ones matter more. Karen hesitated. What are you asking? Harold leaned forward. The room seemed to tilt toward him. I'm asking you to stop trying to contain this. Karen stared. That's your demand. It's my advice, Harold said. Containment is what breaks systems. Karen's phone vibrated. She ignored it. Then it vibrated again. She glanced down despite herself. Her face drained. What now? Richard asked. Karen's voice was quiet. Insurance has called. They want clarification on our risk posture. Richard exhaled softly. That didn't take long. Karen looked between the two men. If this continues, flights will be grounded. Harold nodded. Temporarily. Karen laughed once sharp. You're saying that like it's acceptable. Harold's gaze was unwavering. I'm saying it like it's inevitable. Karen backed away a step. You're willing to disrupt thousands of passengers over a seating dispute. Harold's voice dropped. This was not about a seat. It was about a decision made too easily. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She saw it now. Not fully, but enough. Richard stood. We'll provide a formal notice within the hour. Karen whispered, You're serious. Richard smiled thinly. We always are. Karen left without another word. Reed hovered outside, eyes wide. What's happening? Harold stood smoothing his jacket again. Maintenance, he said. Richard checked his watch. We should move. Not yet, Harold replied. Richard studied him. You want to stay? I want them to feel it, Harold said. Just enough. Through the glass, phones rang. People rushed. The airport hummed louder, faster. Somewhere overhead, another plane roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, unaware that the ground beneath the industry was beginning to shift. Harold looked at his reflection in the glass. Torn sleeve. Calm eyes. He thought of the men on that flight, of Linda's tightened jaw, of Brian's impatience, of how easily people mistook silence for absence. Richard broke the quiet. Once this moves to the board level, there's no stopping it. Harold nodded. I didn't come here to stop it. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. Karen reappeared at the end of the concourse, running now professionalism abandoned. Reed followed, struggling to keep up. Richard placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. Are you ready? Harold's eyes followed the movement of the terminal, the fragile choreography of order, pretending to be permanent. I've been ready for a long time, he said. And somewhere above them, in a sealed cabin hurtling east, a man reclined in a stolen seat, unaware that the ground he trusted was already giving way. The first alert reached the cockpit just after the wheels left the ground. A soft chime, then another. Captain Ellis glanced at the display, expecting weather or routing notes. What he saw instead made his hand pause on the throttle. He read it twice, then a third time, his jaw tightening with each pass. "What is it?" the first officer asked. Ellis didn't answer immediately. He keyed the mic, then stopped. Unkeyed it. "Operations just flagged a provisional review on our fuel credit." The first officer frowned. In flight, Ellis nodded slowly. "That's not normal." Behind them, the cabin had settled into the brittle calm that followed an uncomfortable boarding. People spoke in lower voices than usual. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A man in the aisle seat kept glancing toward the front, as if expecting someone to come back. Brian Whitmore stretched his legs and sighed with satisfaction. The seat felt good, better than he remembered. He adjusted the pillow, tugged the blanket across his knees, and waved a hand as a flight attendant passed. "Can I get a drink?" The attendant hesitated. "We'll be serving shortly." Brian scoffed. "I just watched you remove someone for delaying the flight. And now you're delaying me." She pressed her lips together and moved on. Linda Crawford stood near the galley, arms folded, staring at nothing. Her heart had finally slowed, but something else had taken its place. A tightness, a pressure behind her eyes she couldn't shake. She told herself she'd done her job. That was the mantra. That was how you survived decades in a uniform. You followed protocol. You prioritized flow. You didn't let individuals derail the machine. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. In the terminal, Karen Holt stood under a digital clock counting seconds she could not control. Calls stacked. Messages blinked. Each one chipped away at the version of the morning she had believed in when she walked through the glass doors. "This is not a coincidence," she said into her headset. "I want full exposure, every contract, every dependency." The voice on the other end hesitated. "You want logistics too?" "Yes," Karen snapped, "especially logistics." She ended the call and turned just as Thomas Reed hurried up, breathless. "They're asking questions," he said. "Everyone is asking questions." Karen closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was no panic, only calculation. "Find me everything on Bennett Infrastructure." Quietly. Reed nodded and ran. Harold Bennett watched the activity from a distance, seated now, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Richard Coleman stood nearby, speaking in low tones to someone on his phone. His voice calm, precise, lethal. "They've seen the first tremor," Richard said when he finished. "Insurance won't hold without reassurance. Reassurance won't come." Harold nodded. "It never does when it's needed." Across the terminal, Karen caught sight of him again. She stopped. Their eyes met through the glass and noise. In that instant, she understood something she had missed earlier. This was not a man reacting. This was a man allowing things to happen. Her phone rang again. She answered without greeting. "Yes." There was silence on the line. Then a voice she recognized but did not want to hear. "Karen," the voice said. "We're pausing coverage effective immediately." Her breath caught. "You can't." "We already have," the voice replied. "Pending investigation." The line went dead. Karen lowered the phone slowly. The terminal seemed louder now. The announcements sharper, the lights harsher. She turned back toward Harold, but he was already standing. "Ms. Holt," he said, his voice carrying without effort. She walked toward him, each step heavier than the last. "You're forcing our hand." Harold's gaze was steady. "You forced mine first. This affects thousands of people," she said. "Families, workers." Harold nodded. "It always does." Karen's voice dropped. "What do you want?" Harold did not answer right away. He looked past her through the glass to the runway, where planes rose and fell like punctuation marks in a sentence no one read closely enough. "I want accountability," he said finally. "Not statements, not vouchers. Accountability that costs enough to be remembered." Karen swallowed. "The board will fight." "They always do," Harold said. In the air, Captain Ellis's console chimed again. A longer tone this time. The first officer leaned in, eyes widening. "We've lost secondary fuel authorization." Ellis cursed under his breath. He keyed the mic. "Cabin crew flight deck." Linda's handset crackled. She pressed it to her ear. "Go ahead." Ellis's voice was tight. "We have an issue." Her stomach dropped. "What kind of issue?" Ellis hesitated. "The kind that means we may not be landing where we planned." Linda closed her eyes. "You're kidding." "I wish I were." She looked down the aisle. Passengers watched her now, sensing the shift. Brian raised his head, annoyance flickering. "What's going on?" Linda straightened. "Please remain seated." The cabin lights flickered once. Just once. Enough to send a ripple of unease through the rows. In the terminal, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled thinly. "The board has convened an emergency call." Karen laughed softly. It sounded almost hysterical. "You're dismantling an airline." Harold shook his head. "I'm showing it what it built." Karen stared at him. "This all started because of a seat." Harold's voice hardened. "This started because someone decided a rule only mattered when it was convenient." Silence hung between them. A final call came in. Karen answered, listened, then nodded slowly. When she ended the call, she looked smaller. "They're grounding the fleet," she said. Harold closed his eyes briefly. Not in triumph, in recognition. Above them, the plane banked slightly as the captain adjusted course. The city slipped away beneath cloud cover. Inside the cabin, Linda gripped the edge of a seat to steady herself as the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen." Captain Ellis's voice came through strained but controlled. "Due to an operational issue, we will be diverting." A murmur swelled. Questions. Fear. Brian stood. Diverting to where? Linda lifted the mic, her hands trembling. "Please remain seated." In the terminal, Karen watched Harold turn away, his coat hanging open, the tear still visible. She understood now. The machine had not broken. It had simply met someone who knew where to press. And in the sky, as the plane altered its path, the realization began to spread, seat by seat, that this flight was no longer going where anyone had intended. The announcement hit the cabin like a sudden loss of pressure. Not loud. Just wrong. Captain Ellis's voice carried through the speakers with a careful steadiness that fooled no one who had flown long enough to recognize fear when it learned to sound professional. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an operational issue, we will be diverting to an alternate airport. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. Silence followed. Thick. Then voices rose all at once. Operational issue means what? We're not going to. New York, is this safe? Linda Crawford stood frozen for half a second too long before forcing her body to move. She stepped into the aisle, palms raised posture, rehearsed the way she had been trained to do when turbulence or tempers spiked. Her mouth opened, then closed. The words she had practiced for decades refused to line up. Brian Whitmore was already on his feet. "This is unbelievable," he snapped, yanking his phone from his pocket. "I have meetings. You can't just reroute a flight like this." Linda turned toward him. "Sir, please sit down." "I paid for this seat," Brian said loudly, gesturing around him. "I paid for this flight." A low murmur moved through the cabin. A grey-haired man near the window spoke without standing. So did everyone else. Brian shot him a look. "Stay out of it." The man didn't respond. He simply lifted his phone again and kept recording. Linda felt her throat tighten. The cabin lights seemed brighter now, harsher. She pressed the call button to the flight deck. "Captain, passengers are asking for details." There was a pause. Too long. Then Ellis replied, "Tell them we're awaiting confirmation." Confirmation of what Linda asked quietly. Ellis exhaled. "Of where we're allowed to land." Her hand tightened around the handset. Allowed. She ended the call and turned back to the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're working with air traffic control. Please remain seated." The word allowed echoed in her head, bouncing off memories she didn't want. Rules, authority, compliance. She had always believed in them. Believed they were neutral. Believed they protected the system from chaos. Now the system felt like it was rejecting itself. In the cockpit, the first officer stared at the navigation display. "They've denied us JFK. And Newark." Ellis nodded grimly. "I'm seeing it." "What about Philly?" Ellis shook his head. "No clearance." The first officer swallowed. "Where does that leave us?" Ellis scrolled. His finger stopped. "Ohio. You're kidding. I wish I were." Back in the terminal, Karen Holt stood with her back to a pillar phone pressed to her ear, listening as if her life depended on it. In a way, it did. "This isn't protocol," she said sharply. "You can't deny landing without cause." The voice on the other end was calm, bureaucratic. "The cause is uncertainty. Your insurance status is unresolved." Karen's jaw clenched. "We are working on that." "You should work faster," the voice replied. "For now, the restriction stands." The call ended. Karen lowered the phone slowly. Her reflection in the glass looked older than it had an hour ago. She turned and found Harold Bennett watching her from across the terminal, his expression unreadable. She walked toward him, every step an admission she had not planned to make. "This is spiraling," she said. Harold nodded. "Spirals usually do." "You have to understand," Karen said, lowering her voice. "If this continues, the airline won't survive." Harold looked past her toward the gates, toward the planes, lined up like promises waiting to be broken. "Then it wasn't built to." Karen flinched. "You're talking about thousands of jobs." I'm talking about a culture, Harold replied. One that decided inconvenience justified humiliation. Karen shook her head. You could stop this. Harold met her eyes. I could. But then nothing would change. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because somewhere deep down she knew he was right. She had seen too many incidents buried under settlements, too many apologies drafted by lawyers and forgotten by Monday. A voice crackled over the terminal speakers announcing delays. Then more delays. Screens began to update red text bleeding across blue backgrounds. Cancelled. Pending. Under review. Passengers groaned. A man slammed his carry-on onto the floor. A woman began to cry quietly near a charging station, her phone clutched in both hands. Harold stood. He adjusted his jacket, the tear still visible the fabric, a quiet reminder that this had begun with something physical, something undeniable. Richard Coleman joined him, his phone still in his hand. They're diverting the flight. Harold nodded. Where? Private logistics field, Western Ohio, certified for emergency civilian landing. Harold allowed himself a small breath. Good. Karen stared. You knew? Harold didn't answer. In the air, the plane descended through a layer of grey cloud, the engines changing pitch as the ground rose to meet them. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, searching for city lights that weren't there. What is that? Someone whispered. Below them stretched flat land and long strips of concrete. No terminal, no gates. Just a runway flanked by dark vehicles parked in deliberate lines. Brian felt a flicker of unease crawl up his spine. Where the hell are we? Linda's hands shook as she gripped the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain all seated. The wheels hit the runway hard. Not dangerously, just enough to send a jolt through every spine. The plane slowed, engines roaring, then rolling to a stop far from anything that looked like an airport. Silence followed. Heavy. Expectant. Outside the doors of the black vehicles opened. Figures stepped out. Suits. Earpieces. Stillness. Brian stood again. This is insane. I'm calling my father. Linda looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time that day, she had no answer prepared. The cabin door remained closed. No jet bridge, no welcome announcement. Just the hum of the auxiliary power unit and the distant sound of wind moving through open fields. In the terminal back in Chicago, Karen Holt watched a final notification appear on her screen. Board emergency session. Immediate. She closed her eyes. On the tarmac in Ohio, the mobile stairs rolled into position, metal clanking softly as they locked against the aircraft door. The seal broke with a hiss. Cold air rushed in. The first face visible at the base of the stairs was one Linda recognized instantly, though she had never seen him in this place before. Harold Bennett stood waiting, hands clasped behind his back, his posture calm, his presence absolute. And in that moment, as reality finally aligned with consequence, Linda understood something she had never allowed herself to consider. This flight had not been diverted by weather. It had been redirected by judgment. The door opened with a hydraulic sigh, and the cold rushed in like a verdict. It wasn't the sharp cold of winter storms or mountain air. It was the flat utilitarian cold of open land and concrete stripped of comfort and ceremony. Linda Crawford stood frozen at the top of the aisle, one hand braced against a seat back, watching the mobile stairs settle into place outside the aircraft. No jet bridge, no terminal, no smiling ground crew. Just black vehicles parked in disciplined rows, and men who did not move unless there was a reason to. Captain Ellis stepped out of the cockpit, his face drained of color. He looked at Linda, then at the open door, then back at the cabin full of waiting eyes. "Crew first," he said quietly. "We go down first." Linda swallowed. Her mouth was dry. "Captain, who's in charge down there?" Ellis didn't answer right away. He leaned closer so only she could hear. "The kind of people you don't argue with." That did it. Something inside her finally cracked. Not loudly. Not enough for anyone else to see. Just enough to let the truth in. This was no longer about a delayed flight or an irritated passenger. This was about control. And it had changed hands. She turned toward the cabin, forcing her voice to steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The crew will disembark first." A chorus of protests rose immediately. "You can't leave us here. What is this place? Is this even legal?" Brian Whitmore pushed into the aisle, his face flushed. "No, absolutely not. I'm not staying on this plane while you people disappear." Ellis turned on him, eyes hard. "Sit down." Brian froze. He had never been spoken to like that by someone in uniform. He opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it, and dropped back into his seat, breathing hard. One by one, the flight attendants moved forward. Their heels echoed against the aisle floor, too loud in the silence. Linda was last. As she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering near the frame. For a fleeting second, she considered refusing, digging in, demanding answers. Then she saw him. Harold Bennett stood at the bottom of the stairs, framed by grey sky and open land. He was no longer wearing the torn jacket. A clean, dark coat rested on his shoulders, now perfectly fitted the fabric, heavy and deliberate. His posture was unchanged, straight, balanced. His hands were clasped behind his back, not in submission, but in ownership. He looked up at her, not with anger, with recognition. Linda's knees weakened. She gripped the railing and forced herself down, each step the metal cold beneath her shoes. The wind cut through her uniform, biting, unforgiving. When she reached the tarmac, she joined the rest of the crew, who stood in a loose line, shivering eyes darting. No one spoke. Harold stepped forward. The men behind him did not move. They did not need to. "Captain Ellis," Harold said. Ellis straightened. "Sir." "You followed procedure as you understood it," Harold said. "You're free to go." Ellis hesitated. "The passengers." "They'll be handled," Harold replied. Ellis nodded once, relief and confusion battling on his face. He turned and motioned to his first officer. They walked away toward a waiting vehicle without looking back. Harold turned his attention to the crew. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, taking each of them in. When it reached Linda, it stopped. "Miss Crawford," he said. Her breath hitched. "Mr. Bennett?" "You told me to move because it was easier," Harold said. His voice was calm, but it carried across the open space. You told me the system required it. Linda shook her head, tears burning her eyes. I was doing my job. Harold nodded. That's what everyone says. She swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were. Harold took one step closer. That's the point. The words landed like a blow. Linda's legs gave out. She dropped to her knees on the cold tarmac, the sound of impact dull and final. She didn't try to get back up. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking years of certainty collapsing under the weight of one sentence. I've given my life to that airline, she sobbed. I followed every rule. Harold looked down at her. You followed convenience. He turned away before she could say anything else. Behind him, two men moved. Brian Whitmore was halfway down the stairs now, rage written across his face. Hey, he shouted. You can't just hold us here. Do you have any idea who I am? Harold stopped. Brian reached the bottom step and planted his feet. My father will hear about this. This is unlawful detention. Harold turned slowly. Your father already has? Brian faltered. What? Harold gestured slightly. One of the men beside him spoke for the first time, his voice flat. Archer Whitmore's accounts are under review. His access is frozen, pending investigation. Brian laughed, sharp and hollow. That's a bluff. Another man held up a tablet. The screen glowed. Bank notices, red flags, official language that did not bluff. Brian's face drained of color. You can't do this. Harold met his eyes. I didn't. You did. When you decided someone else didn't belong. Brian took a step back. Then another. He turned, looking for support, for outrage, for anyone to save him. The cabin windows were filled with faces now, passengers pressed close, watching in silence. Secure him, Harold said quietly. It happened fast. Too fast for shouting to matter. Brian was restrained and guided away, his protests dissolving into panicked noise that carried across the field before being swallowed by the wind. Harold turned back toward the plane. Passengers of Flight 308, he said, his voice amplified now, steady and clear. You were diverted because a system failed you. Transportation will be provided. Compensation will follow. You did nothing wrong. The cabin was silent. Harold nodded once. We'll begin shortly. Richard Coleman appeared at his side folder tucked under his arm. The board vote is underway, he said. Numbers are shifting. Harold didn't look at him. His eyes were on the plane, on the empty seat at the front, on the idea that had been taken for granted. Let them vote, Harold said. This was decided long before today. Linda remained on the ground, knees aching, uniform damp with cold. She watched as vehicles moved, as systems realigned without her, as the world continued with a precision she had believed she controlled. For the first time in decades, she understood what it meant to be replaceable. And for the first time, she understood who had been in that seat all along. The boardroom in Dallas was built to intimidate. Glass walls, polished stone, a table long enough to separate power from dissent. By the time the emergency session was called to order, the room was already full of people pretending not to panic. Screens flickered at the far end, numbers sliding downward in red increments that felt less like data and more like bleeding. The chairman cleared his throat. Let's begin. No one spoke. They were all staring at the same line on the screen. Credit facilities under review. Insurance coverage suspended pending investigation. Fuel contracts paused. Words that had never appeared together before now aligned like a firing squad. A woman near the window whispered, "This can't be happening over one incident." A man across from her snapped, "It's not one incident, it's exposure." The general counsel leaned forward, hands steepled. "We have a civil rights issue, video evidence, multiple eyewitnesses, and now we have a material adverse change clause being triggered by our own partners." The CEO, Martin Kessler, looked like he hadn't slept. Late 50s. Perfect suit wrinkled at the elbows. He rubbed his temples. "Where is this coming from?" No one answered immediately. Then the screen at the end of the room changed. A new window opened. Richard Coleman's face appeared calm and composed, as if he had all the time in the world. "Good morning," he said. Several board members shifted in their seats. "Who authorized this call?" Kessler demanded. Richard smiled faintly. "Authorization follows ownership." The chairman stiffened. "Excuse me." Richard glanced down briefly, then back up. "As of this morning, Bennett Infrastructure Holdings, through its investment vehicles, has acquired a controlling interest in your outstanding voting shares." The room erupted. "That's impossible. You can't just—" "When did this happen?" Richard waited. He always did. When the noise subsided, he continued. "The shares were acquired legally at market price over a series of transactions accelerated by your stock's decline. All filings are in order." Kessler's face drained of color. "This is a hostile takeover." Richard nodded. "Hostile situations often produce them." A woman at the table whispered, "Bennett." The name moved through the room like a current. Back in Ohio, the passengers of Flight 308 were being guided down the stairs one by one into waiting buses. There was confusion, but also something else. Relief. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by the certainty that something had gone very wrong and that someone else was now handling it. A retired couple held hands as they stepped onto the pavement. "I've never seen anything like this," the woman said. Her husband nodded. "Means it was overdue." Harold Bennett watched from a distance, allowing the process to unfold without interference. He had insisted on that. No grand gestures, no speeches, just systems correcting themselves. Richard approached him, phone pressed to his ear, then ended the call. "It's done. The board has voted." Harold didn't ask how. He already knew. "And Kessler." "Removed," Richard said. "Effective immediately." Harold nodded once. "Good." Linda Crawford sat in the back of one of the buses, staring at her hands. They looked older now, the veins more visible. She replayed the morning over and over, searching for the moment where she could have chosen differently. She found it. She found several. That was the worst part. Across the aisle, a younger flight attendant glanced at her, then away. No judgment, just distance. At the far end of the tarmac, Brian Whitmore sat in the back of a security vehicle, wrists cuffed, eyes wide and unfocused. He muttered to himself, fragments of denial breaking apart under the weight of reality. His phone lay face down on the seat beside him, useless now. He had never understood systems, only access. In Dallas, the chairman's voice shook. "What do you want?" The screen shifted again. This time, Harold Bennett appeared. The room went still. Harold sat centered in the frame, composed, the tear in his jacket no longer visible. His voice was calm when he spoke. "I want this company to remember what it forgot." Kessler leaned forward, desperation cutting through his pride. "We can fix this. Apologies, policy reviews, settlements." Harold shook his head. "Those are repairs. I'm here to change the foundation." A board member scoffed weakly. "And you think you're qualified?" Harold's eyes hardened. "I built networks that feed cities and fuel nations. You built excuses." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. "I am not here to destroy you," Harold continued. "I am here to make you smaller, humble enough to see people again." The chairman swallowed. "What happens now?" Harold leaned back slightly. "Now you operate under new standards, new leadership, new accountability." Richard stepped into frame. "And all further communication will go through our office." The call ended. In Ohio, the last bus door closed. Engines started. The field grew quieter. The plane sat empty now, its presence reduced to metal and consequence. Harold watched as Linda was escorted toward a separate vehicle. Not arrested, not absolved. Suspended between what she had been and what she would have to become. She looked back once. Their eyes met. He did not nod. He did not turn away. He simply acknowledged her the way one acknowledged a completed transaction. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Harold felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, not relief, responsibility. Richard sensed it. "You could have stopped earlier." Harold nodded. "I know. And you didn't." Harold looked toward the horizon where the land stretched flat and honest. Some lessons need to be expensive. The vehicles pulled away one by one. The field emptied. The noise faded. Above them, clouds drifted without concern for human systems. And somewhere between the ground that had shifted and the sky that never did a new order began to take shape. The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor polish, a scent that clung to places where decisions outlived the people who made them. Morning light filtered through high windows, catching dust in slow motion. The bailiff called the room to order, his voice practiced almost gentle. No one moved quickly. This was not a place for haste. Brian Whitmore sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, suit ill-fitting, in a way money used to fix. His hands trembled when he clasped them together, a rhythm he could not control. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear and tell him this had all been a misunderstanding. No one did. Across the aisle, Linda Crawford sat alone. No uniform, no scarf. Her hair pulled back too tightly as if she were bracing against a wind only she could feel. She stared at the bench, not the judge, not the jurors filing in with their quiet curiosity and folded arms. Her face carried the shock of someone who had believed in permanence and then watched it dissolve. Richard Coleman entered without ceremony and took his place at counsel's table. He set down a thin folder and waited. He did not shuffle papers. He did not clear his throat. He had learned that stillness unsettled people more than motion. Harold Bennett arrived last. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the back for a moment, hands folded eyes, taking in the room the way a builder studies a foundation. The murmur softened as people noticed him. Some recognized his face from the clips that had spread across screens. Others sensed the weight without knowing its source. He took his seat. The judge entered a woman in her early 60s, with a voice that carried authority without volume. She scanned the room once, then nodded. "We are here to determine facts," she said, "not to satisfy appetites." The prosecutor rose and began with the video. No sound at first, just the image. A man standing, hands visible, a uniformed figure pulling, fabric tearing, phones lifting. The room watched without blinking. When the audio came on, the tension thickened. Words overlapped. A warning, a command, a man saying calmly that he was not resisting. Brian closed his eyes. He had seen this clip before, but never like this. Never with 12 strangers watching him watch it. When it ended, the judge turned to the defense. "You may proceed." Brian's attorney stood. A tired man, earnest, outmatched. He spoke about confusion, about stress, about a crowded morning and miscommunication. He spoke quickly, as if speed might outrun evidence. Richard rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth as worn leather. "Confusion does not explain entitlement." He walked to the screen and tapped once. Another video played, this one from a different angle. Brian's voice clear and sharp, his laughter, the line about who always sat there, the dismissal of rules when they did not bend. Richard turned to the jury. "This is not about a seat," he said. "It is about the belief that some people are movable." Linda's shoulders slumped. The words hit her harder than the footage. Movable. She had never used that word, but she had lived by it. The judge leaned forward. "Call your witness." Richard nodded. "We call Harold Bennett." Harold rose. The room shifted again. He walked to the stand with measured steps, hand steady, as he swore the oath. When he sat, he looked not at the jury, but at the wall behind them, as if anchoring himself to something older than the moment. Richard's questions were simple. Name, occupation, purpose of travel. Harold answered plainly. No titles, no flourishes. "And what happened when you were asked to move?" Richard asked. Harold paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was selection. "I asked for an explanation," he said. "I asked for verification. I was denied both." "And how did you respond when security arrived?" "I stood," Harold said. "I told them I was not resisting." The prosecutor objected. Overruled. Richard nodded. "Did you raise your voice?" "No." "Did you threaten anyone?" "No." "Did you believe you were being treated fairly?" Harold met the jury's eyes for the first time. "I believed I was being treated conveniently." The room was silent. The defense declined to cross-examine. There was nothing left to fracture. When Linda was called, she walked to the stand with small, careful steps. She took the oath with a voice that barely held. Her testimony was halting at first, then steadier, as something like resolve took over. She spoke about protocol, about pressure, about choosing the path that kept things moving. And why that path, Richard asked gently. Linda swallowed. "Because I thought it mattered more than the person." There it was, the confession without accusation. The judge watched her closely. "You are saying you made a decision that prioritized efficiency over dignity." Linda nodded, tears tracking silently. "Yes, Your Honor." The verdict came swiftly, on the charges that applied guilty. The judge's voice did not rise when she pronounced it. It did not need to. As Brian was led away, he twisted in his seat and looked back at Harold. For a moment, his expression was naked fear. Then it hardened into something smaller. He said nothing. The doors closed behind him with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. Outside, reporters clustered like birds, questions overlapping, cameras flashing. Harold stopped at the top of the steps. He did not pose. He did not smile. "I didn't come here to win," he said. "I came here because the truth doesn't move itself." Someone shouted, "What happens to the airline?" Harold paused. "It learns," he said. "Or it doesn't." Linda exited last. No microphones chased her. No questions followed. She stood alone on the steps for a moment, the city noise rushing back around her, indifferent and loud. She pulled her coat tighter and walked away. Harold watched her go. He felt no triumph, only the quiet certainty that a line had been drawn where one had been missing. Inside the courthouse, the judge gathered her papers and looked once more at the empty benches. She had seen cases like this before. Rare, but not unheard of. Systems corrected by pressure, people by consequence. Outside, the wind lifted scraps of paper and carried them down the street. The day continued, as days always did. And somewhere between the weight of a verdict and the lightness of truth finally spoken, the world adjusted itself by a fraction. 6 months later, the airport no longer felt the same, even though the walls hadn't moved, and the runways still cut the land in the same straight lines. Change had a way of settling into places quietly like dust. You only noticed when the light shifted. The airline's name on the terminal had been replaced, the old logo peeled away, and forgotten the new one, simpler, restrained, almost modest. People walked past it without thinking. That Harold Bennett knew was the point. Inside the executive offices, the furniture had been rearranged, not upgraded, rearranged. Desks pulled closer together. Glass panels frosted where they had once been clear. A subtle message about transparency that no longer needed to perform. Sarah Lynn stood at the head of the table tablet in hand, eyes focused but calm. Early 40s. She had started on the ground, lifting bags in rain and heat, memorizing the rhythms of departures, the way others memorized spreadsheets. When she spoke now, people listened, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. "Our on-time performance is up 12%, she said. "Customer complaints are down across all age groups, especially seniors." Harold sat near the window, hands folded, listening. He wore no title in this room. He did not need one. And staff training. Sarah nodded. Mandatory. Not just policy. Judgment. Scenario-based. We teach people how to slow down before they decide. A man at the far end cleared his throat. "We've had some resistance." Sarah met his eyes. "From whom?" "Middle management," he said. "People used to doing things the old way." Harold spoke, then voice quiet but carrying. "Old ways aren't traditions. their habits. The man nodded, chastened. Outside the window, a plane lifted smoothly into the sky, sunlight catching its wings. Harold watched it climb, feeling the familiar mix of distance and connection. Infrastructure had taught him that you could build systems strong enough to hold weight, but never strong enough to ignore gravity. After the meeting, Sarah walked with him down the corridor. "You could have taken the title," she said. Harold shook his head. "Titles change how people hear you." She smiled faintly. "And power doesn't." He stopped near a wall where photographs had been rehung. New ones. Ground crews, mechanics, flight attendants laughing between shifts, not posed, caught mid-moment. "This matters," he said. "It does," Sarah replied. "People see themselves now." In a smaller office across town, Linda Crawford sat at a narrow desk, headset pressed to her ear. The room was windowless, lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed softly. She wore a plain sweater. No insignia, no scarf. Her name badge read simply, Linda. "Thank you for calling," she said, voice steady. "How can I help you?" A man on the line complained about a missed connection. Linda listened without interrupting. When he finished, she took a breath. "I understand why you're frustrated," she said. "Let's fix what we can." She hung up and stared at the wall for a moment. The work was repetitive, humbling, honest. Some days it felt like punishment. Other days it felt like a chance to rebuild something she hadn't known she'd broken. At night, she replayed the moment on the tarmac when she had fallen to her knees. She no longer tried to justify it. She tried to learn from it. That was harder. Across state lines, Brian Whitmore sat in a grey room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and regret. He had lost weight. His hair had grown out unevenly. He spent his days reading old magazines and waiting for time to move faster than it ever did. The seat across from him remained empty. No visitors, no calls. He thought often about the flight, about how certain he had been, how quickly that certainty had evaporated. The realization did not make him better. Not yet. But it made him quieter. Back at the airport, Harold walked through the terminal alone. No entourage, no announcements. He liked it that way. He stopped at a coffee stand and ordered black coffee. The barista, a young man with tired eyes, slid the cup across the counter. "Flight delay today," the barista said, glancing at the screen. Harold nodded. "It happens." The barista hesitated. "You're him, right?" Harold looked up. "Who?" "The guy from the video." Harold considered. "I was in a video," he said. The barista smiled nervously. "My dad watches those clips. He's 68. Says it made him feel seen." Harold held the cup for a moment before lifting it. "Tell him thank you." He walked on past gates and waiting passengers, past the quiet rituals of a travel that had existed long before him and would continue long after. He felt the weight of the months behind him, not as exhaustion, but as gravity. Responsibility again. Always. At the gate, a flight attendant checked boarding passes. She looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. Not the forced smile of obligation. The easy one. "Good afternoon, sir," she said. "Welcome." Harold returned the smile and stepped onto the jet bridge. The hum of the plane greeted him familiar and steady. Inside the cabin was calm, no raised voices, no tension hanging in the air, just people settling in, trusting that the system would carry them where it promised. He reached his seat and paused, not to savor it, to acknowledge it. Then he sat. As the plane taxied, Harold looked out the window at the ground crew moving with practiced efficiency. He thought about all the places he had been dragged through systems that did not see him, about how easily those systems had assumed he would move when pushed. The engines roared, pressing him back gently. The plane lifted. The ground fell away. Harold closed his eyes for a moment. Not in relief, in resolve. Change had cost more than money. It had cost certainty. It had cost comfort. But it had also restored something quieter and harder to measure. Dignity. And as the plane climbed into open sky, Harold understood that this part was finished. The rest would unfold the way all durable things did. Slowly, intentionally, with people finally paying attention. The plane leveled off above the cloud line, sunlight pouring through the windows in a clean, steady wash that made everything inside the cabin feel lighter than it was on the ground. Harold Bennett sat with his hands folded, not working, not reading, simply watching the quiet choreography around him. Seatbelts clicked open. A magazine rustled. A flight attendant moved down the aisle with unhurried confidence, offering water without forcing cheer. No one raised their voice. No one felt the need to. This was what order looked like when it was earned. Across the aisle, an older couple spoke softly, leaning close so their words stayed theirs. The man gestured toward the window, tracing an invisible line in the sky. The woman smiled and nodded, her hand resting on his forearm. Harold noticed how relaxed they seemed, how unguarded. People who trusted the process rarely thought about it. They just lived inside it. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, announcing cruising altitude and arrival time. There was no applause. There never was any more. Just acceptance. The kind that came when people believed things were being handled. Harold leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to escape. To remember. He remembered the jet bridge, the cold, the torn fabric, the way the system had tried to move him out of the way without looking at him first. He remembered Linda's voice when she told him to stand up. Not cruel, not kind, just efficient. He remembered Brian's impatience, the confidence of someone who had never imagined consequence as a personal experience. And he remembered the choice he had made in that moment, not to shout, not to beg, not to comply out of fear. He had chosen stillness, chosen patience, chosen to let the truth arrive at its own speed. That decision had cost him time. It had cost others comfort. It had cost an airline its illusion of immunity. But it had returned something larger than all of that. Harold opened his eyes as the attendant stopped beside him. She offered a glass of water. He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome, sir," she replied, and moved on. Simple exchanges mattered more than people realized. They were the smallest units of respect. Stack enough of them together, and you built something durable. On the ground below, life continued in fragments Harold would never see. Linda Crawford sat at her desk as another call came in, listening more than she spoke, choosing words carefully now. She no longer rushed people off the line. She let them finish. Every day was quieter than the one before. Harder in some ways. Truer in others. In a facility far from any runway, Brian Whitmore stared at a concrete wall and counted breaths. He no longer thought about seats. He thought about silence, about how loud it could be when no one rushed to fill it. He had time now. Too much of it. Time to sit with the version of himself that had never been challenged. In an office overlooking a different terminal, Sarah Lynn reviewed another report, then set it aside and looked out at the tarmac. She watched a crew guide a plane into position, hands signaling with practiced clarity. She thought about what it had taken to change a culture without burning it down, about how leadership was less about command and more about removing excuses. And somewhere between all of them, between what had been lost and what had been corrected, the system kept moving. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But with intention. The plane began its descent. The angle shifted. The hum of the engines changed pitch. Harold felt the subtle pressure in his ears and swallowed once, grounding himself in the physical reality of the moment. He glanced around the cabin again at faces that did not know his story, beyond what they might have seen online, if they had seen it at all. Faces that trusted the process enough to lean back and close their eyes. That trust was fragile. He knew that. It always had been. It depended on thousands of small decisions made by people who believed rules applied to everyone or to no one at all. As the wheels touched down, the landing smooth and unremarkable, Harold felt no surge of triumph, just completion, the kind that came when something unfinished finally settled into place. The plane taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off. People stood, stretching, reaching for bags, returning to themselves. Harold waited as he always did, letting others pass first. When he finally stepped into the aisle, the movement felt natural, unforced. No one blocked his way. No one questioned his place. At the door, the flight attendant smiled again. "Have a good day, sir." "You too," Harold replied. He walked up the jet bridge at an unhurried pace, merging into the flow of travelers without ceremony. Just another man arriving where he intended to go. Behind him, the plane would turn around and depart again, carrying new stories, new chances for the system to prove what it had learned. Ahead of him, the terminal opened wide, full of noise and purpose, and people who believed, at least for today, that fairness was not too much to ask. Harold adjusted his coat and moved forward, blending into the crowd, content not to be seen, only to know that something had shifted in a way that would not easily shift back. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can be told. And if you feel compelled to speak, share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words. Justice still matters.